The book starts with a very imperial and powerful composition, the Radetzky March. It was used in warfare. It was very important in motivating the simple soldiers to fight the enemy.
You're listening to the Transformative Podcast, brought to you by the Research Center for the History of Transformations at the University of Vienna.
Hello and welcome to the Transformative Podcast of the Research Center for the History of Transformations. My name is Käthler, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very special guest, Philipp Ther, Professor of Central European History at the University of Vienna and Director of RECET. Philipp Ther's new book, Der Klang der Monarchie, The Sound of Habsburg, was published just a few weeks ago by Suhrkamp. It has already received widespread recognition and has been nominated for the Science Book of the Year award, granted by Austria's Federal Ministry for Women, Science and Research. Most listeners will know Philipp Ther for his research on the transformation processes in Central and Eastern Europe since 1989, as well as his work on nationalism, particularly its darker sides, and on migration, topics he has explored in numerous books and essays over the past decades. Philipp, what led you to take this new approach of looking at histories through the lens of music?
Oh, it has been a passion of mine all around, and I wanted to write a transformative book which combines listening and reading. And that comes actually from teaching. I'm responsible also for teaching about the non-German speaking Habsburg lands and the successor states. That's what makes Central Europe. And I have done big lectures on the Habsburg Empire and its cultural history. And I started there to use music at the very outset in an illustrative form. I didn't want to speak for 90 minutes non-stop in the usual university lecture. And instead I decided, okay, let's play music to show the big processes like Enlightenment, the Romantic Age, nation building, the emancipation of workers, of women, and all sorts of important processes which transformed the Habsburg Empire. And so for that I used music. But then I also changed the way how I used the music. After a while, I put it up at the beginning of a lecture and was asking the students, well, what do you hear out of that music? What is the meaning of it? And then I asked them to write a small essay instead of, the dull practice of delivering one home-written essay after the other one. And actually it worked really well. Even people who did not know about music had the right intuition, the right feeling, what was expressed in the music they were listening to.
You created a new term, Habsburg Pop. What's that about?
That is a very central chapter of the book where I'm combining all the popular music of the Habsburg Empire. Actually, that already starts with Mozart, who had a discussion with his father how to compose in a popular way. So they were already thinking about a mass audience with one of the essentials of popular music. And then it goes on with the waltz, the polka, so the two major global fashions of music. And it continues then with more regional or local music traditions like the Schrammel music in Vienna, so also for small ensembles which could be played on the streets or in garden restaurants. And it ends up then with the popular tunes of the operetta, some of which already in the late 19th century were called Schlager. I would call it a hit, right? And these tunes then went also all over the world and were popularized, and all that makes what I call Habsburg Pop. Nowadays we perceive it as classical music mostly, but actually at the time it was mostly for dancing, for live concerts, open air, all sorts of venues for the masses.
Would you say that music was woven into the very fabric of the Habsburg monarchy more deeply than in other empires?
Yes, it was constituted for the Habsburg Empire. Actually, that starts already in the time of the Baroque, when the rulers used music, grand opera spectacles to show their power. So it was a display of power. So in the very beginning already in the 18th century, it was used for representative purposes and to show the might of the dynasty, but also of the state. And that continued all around until the very end of the monarchy. It also, in a way, ended musically in the First World War.
Can you think of compositions that best embody this intertwining of music and empire?
The book starts with a very imperial and powerful composition, the Radetzky March. So that was created in 1848, and it was very important in marking a turn of moods in the revolution. So Strauss' father, he created something which we can regard as a game changer. In August of 1848, there was the proletarian revolution starting, and he was actually an adherent of the liberal revolution, of the bourgeois one. And then he switched sides by honoring the great victor, the counter-revolutionary general, Field Marshal Radetzky, who had just won a battle against the revolutionary Italians. Milan remained in the Habsburg domains, and this was the very beginning of the victory of the Habsburgs over all revolutions, step by step. And when Strauss then had this great victory parade and his march, that really reinforced the loyalist forces. But then also the Radetzky March had yet another meaning, and that is the very, very start of the book. It was used in warfare. That is hardly known, but in 1866, the so-called German War, it was employed in the battles. And I have eyewitness accounts of the very first battle near Trutnov, or in German Tarautenau, in northern Bohemia. So the Prussians had invaded the Austrian Empire, and then they sent 25,000 soldiers, and they fought back. And we have these wonderful eyewitness accounts saying, well, our soldiers in the old Austrian tradition stormed against the Prussians, crying out alien. Alien means hail in Hungarian. And then, well, hunting the Prussians. And actually they chased them out near Trutnov. Then in the end, they lost the war. But nevertheless, it was very important in motivating the simple soldiers and to fight the enemy. So that is the second major, you can say, powerful use. Then we have also quite a few examples where composers from outside of Vienna contributed to that very imperial music. For example, Smetana and his Triumph Symphony. This was written in 1854 for the wedding of Franz Josef and the famous Sissi. And, well, it is a symphony which plays variations up and down in a very beautiful way about the imperial anthem, so the Kaiserlied. So also a composer who is considered as a very national one, which is also true, contributed to the very imperial sound of Habsburg.
When reading your book, it becomes clear quite fast that the compositions you mentioned come from all the various regions of the Habsburg Empire. One could almost speak of a truly multicultural musical world. Would you say that this diversity was one of the reasons for the empire's musical success?
Yes, that is definitely true. The Habsburg Empire was much more diverse and much more federalized than the British Empire or France or even the Russian Empire. And the diversity can be seen already in the Viennese waltz. Okay, nowadays we take it as a symbol for the monarchy and we call it Viennese. But actually, at the very beginning, in the very early 19th century, the first composers came from Bohemia and, for God's sake, from Prussia. And the first compendium, 12 dozen waltzes, that was created by František Pecháček, and he originally had come from Bohemia to Vienna, so he was a migrant. Actually, also Mozart remained a migrant. He never became a citizen of Vienna. He always remained a guy from Salzburg, so even him we could count as a migrant, and this goes on and on and on. And what is also happening, because it was so multi-central, we have different musical centers competing. So there's Vienna, Prague, the later Budapest becomes ever more productive, then Brno, Brünn, in Moravia, quite close to Vienna. And so many centers are contributing to this musical boom and create their own musical traditions. And that all gets intermingled, and that makes the Habsburg musical empire.
In what way does this musical legacy still resonate in the self-understanding of Austria and the other nations born from the Habsburg Empire?
After World War I, when everything was gone, the empire, Austria tried to define itself as a musical nation. And you can see a direct impact because the former boss of the Musical Historical Central, that was a subunit of the Central Army Command, he then established the Salzburg Festspiele, so the Salzburg Festival. So you see a direct personal continuity. And what did this guy, I will mention his name here, Bernhard Paumgartner, what did he envision? That Austrian statehood, but also the glory of Austria, can at least somewhat be restored by investing into music. So this was a deliberate attempt to continue this old idea of a musical empire to become then a musical republic. And you see a parallel process in Czechoslovakia, where the post-war government and the president himself, Masaryk, heavily invested into music, into avant-garde music, microtonal music, nowadays almost forgotten, but back then it was defined as the music of liberty, as a democratic kind of music. And so that was hugely important, or Bartók and Kodály in Hungary. So you see a lot of figures who were still born in the late 19th century and then shape or try to shape their identities of the successor states. And then of course you have it also on a more popular level in tourism, marketing, you know, Vienna as the city of music, all the stars, the Walk of Fame in the center. So it is definitely used also for commercial purposes until today.
I'm afraid we have reached the end of this podcast. Thank you very much, Philipp Ther, for taking the time to share a few thoughts from your book with us.
You're most welcome. I wish you a truly good experience in the combination of reading and listening, because that's the point about this book. One can read, and then every 5 or so pages, there is a QR code. And then you just take your mobile phone, you can click on the QR code, boom, you will be connected to a streaming service, which we are cooperating, and then boom, the music will be there. So you can enjoy both. The more intellectual experience of reading and the very emotional practice of listening.